Hi there, Bob from Insidium, Top Tip Tuesday time. On today's video, we're going to be taking a particle simulation, a fluid sim from Nexus. We'll be meshing it, and then I'll show you how we can get some nice motion blur effects on that live mesh in Redshift. So, let's get started. In our scene, we have this nice fluid particle simulation using the Nexus Fluids tools, this nice kind of high surface tension look. Now, this was really quick to set up. You can dig into the scene file to see how we did it with our various Nexus modifiers, but this was quick. It took 3.5 minutes to cache, and it looks really nice. So what we want to do is render this. So we're going to activate this OpenVDBMesher. Let's turn that on, and in that mesher, if we go to the general tab, you can see we're meshing that particle emitter. We can make those particles invisible now. So you can see that we now have this mesh, and this has just got a little bit of curvature smoothing on. So we want some motion blur, because if we render this, look, it's got a Redshift material on. If we render this in the IPR, let's get that going. It looks really nice, but this is fast moving fluid and we have no motion blur at the moment, so it's going to just look too crisp as these droplets are falling down. Now, the usual object motion blur in Redshift doesn't work with volume meshes like the OpenVDBMesher, and that's because it relies on tracking the points, the vertices of the object, seeing how they're moving frame to frame, and then it works out the blur. But with volume meshes, the points actively change every single frame, so it can't track them from one frame to the next because the points are always dynamic and changing. But we are able to do it with the OpenVDBMesher to get that motion blur. This is how we do it. We need to go to the mesher itself, go to the tags tab, and we need to activate transfer velocity. When I click this, you can see that we have got 4 vertex maps appeared. We've got a color one, and then 3 regular vertex maps, X, Y, and Z, and these are the ones that we need. And what this has done is taken the velocity information from the particle, and it's generated XYZ velocity information and passed it on into the mesh using these maps. So there is the Z, the Y, and the X. And we need to pass this on to Redshift. So to do that, we go to Tags, Render Tags, Redshift Object Tag. And in the Motion Blur tab, we need to activate this motion vector and drag in our maps to these link fields. So look, here's X, Y, Z. Now we need to activate motion blur in the render settings for Redshift as well. So let's go to Render, Settings, Redshift, Advanced, Motion Blur tab, and we need to switch on motion blur, and deformation blur needs to be switched on. So now that we have done that, you can still see we've got no motion blur going on. It will not work in the IPR. Motion blur must be viewed in a full render. So we can do that by rendering to the picture viewer or by using this render button here. So let's just stop the IPR. We'll hit render. Now this is going to render motion blur, but it's going to be so subtle we may not be able to even see it. Not really that obvious. And we can change the amount of blur now we've got it set up in our Redshift tag with this scale amount. So look, if we put this scale up to say 20 and render again, we're now going to see some much more pronounced motion blur. And here it comes. Yeah, I can see it even in the preview. Yeah, so look, we're starting to get this nice motion blur now. And we can go really high on this. Now, I'm going to do something which is going to demonstrate one issue, which I'll show you how to fix. If we put this on a crazy scale, like 60, so we've got loads of motion blur. Let's get that one rendering. And this one has got a possibility to start getting some weird artifacts as we have such a big blur out. Yeah, look, can you see these artifacts here? And we've got a few speckly bits. And the reason that's happening is because if we go back to our mesher and highlight one of our vertex maps, you can see that we've got this kind of speckliness here where some of these have got lots of movement, lots of weight, and some have zero. And because they're kind of neighbouring vertices with very differing values, some of them are being blurred out, some aren't, and at very high values it's causing this. But we can fix it just by smoothing this map out. And we do that by going to the OpenVDBMesher, tags, and look, we have a smoothing option underneath these velocities. So if we put this on, say 20, you'll see that it's smoothed those out, look. So then if we re-render, because we've smoothed those neighbouring vertices, when we get this render now, these artifacts are not going to be there because the mesh has similar velocities from vertex to vertex. Let's have a look. Yeah, so now we've smoothed those out. We could smooth it out further should we wish, but I mean, obviously this is probably a little bit too much motion blur anyway. Let's put that back down to, say, 25. Do one last render, and this is how we can get from a volume mesh, we can get this volume velocity information from the particles, pass it on into the mesh for Redshift to read to apply this fantastic motion blur for fluid meshes.